Back in 1950, Brazil would host the World Cup in its home soil for the very first time in history. The entirety of the nation were confident that they could win it all. Brazil had remained unbeaten throughout the entire tournament, and back then it was played in a group-like point system. There weren't yet any knockout stages. And with Brazil not having a single loss, they only needed a simple draw in their sixth and final match against Uruguay to lift their first ever World Cup trophy in front of a home crowd-filled Maracanã Stadium with nearly 200,000 people watching. After a hard-fought standstill with the score being tied 1-1, in the 79th minute of the match, however, Brazilian goalkeeper Moacir Barbosa, who had been solid all tournament, was expecting a cross coming into the box, and in anticipation, he ended up moving up and being out of position, allowing Uruguay to score the game-winning goal. That single error not only changed his life for the worst, but it would also change Brazilian football and football as a whole forever. Barbosa was banned from the national team and blamed as the sole scapegoat for Brazil's failures, threatened for the rest of his life, with himself and his family being ridiculed for decades. In Barbosa's words, the maximum punishment in Brazil is 30 years imprisonment, but I've been paying for something I'm not even responsible for 50 years. 13 years later, he was mockingly gifted that literal goalpost of the match from the Brazilian Federation as a joke. And even 30 years after that incident, Barbosa was denied the opportunity to commentate for a Brazilian match by the Brazilian Federation. After the 1950 World Cup, black goalkeepers in Brazil were pretty much non-existent. The mere thought of becoming one was literally discouraged. Ever since Barbosa's mistake, the Brazilian people would hold the belief that black goalkeepers were unreliable and simply inferior. This attitude would also slowly reflect and make its way across the entire world. Many young black kids who wanted to make it to the league or even just locally in Brazil simply had to give up on their dreams of becoming shot stoppers. They either had to find a different position or leave the sport. However, 50 years later, a goalkeeper would rise up, dare to face the odds, and eventually shatter those stereotypes. As he would become so undeniably good, he would force his own nation and the rest of the world to look back at its history of discrimination as he rose to the top as one of, and for a time, the best goalkeeper in the world. His name was Nelson de Jesus Silva, but you might know him by a much simpler name, Dida. So today, we're gonna look at how one of the most overlooked and underrated goalkeepers of the 2000s completely changed the game of football. However, his path to doing so, especially as a Brazilian child, was far from straightforward. While many kids his age absolutely loved and adored the game of football, the young Dida's favorite sport was actually volleyball. With his natural height and being taller than most kids his age, plus his incredible hand-eye coordination and reflexes, the sport seemed like a perfect fit. However, in Brazil, unless you were near the beach, volleyball wasn't nearly as accessible or easy to play as football. Eventually, Dida would be drawn more and more to the street games in his neighborhood, watching other kids gather around and kick anything that even remotely resembled a ball. And it was there that he would find himself slowly joining them. Eventually, he started to get invited to play in futsal matches, and there it quickly became apparent that he had a gift. Not quite exactly with his feet, but with his hands. His volleyball background had given him remarkable reflexes, an instinctive understanding of positioning, and the ability to react faster than his opponents. As soon as he stood in goal, it almost felt natural and destined. But in Brazil, choosing to be a goalkeeper, especially a black goalkeeper, was more than just an unconventional decision. It was a rebellious act. Not only was it extremely frowned upon, but it was so intertwined with the local football culture that most black Brazilian kids wouldn't even dare to try. Because of the deep-rooted distrust of black goalkeepers, it simply wasn't wise to try and be one. For decades, any attempts of a new black goalkeeper coming up were quietly pushed aside and their career stunted before they could even take off. A black Brazilian man could be a striker, midfielder, or even a defender, just not a goalkeeper. Never again. And that was the reality the young Dida was born into. But despite the warnings and despite the unspoken barriers, he refused to have such a ridiculous stereotype define his life. When he joined Cruzeiro's youth academy, coaches were initially hesitant. Of course, they recognized his undeniable talent, but as sad as it was, even at the youth level, placing a black goalkeeper on the team would bring nothing but unwanted scrutiny. The scars of 1950 had still lingered, and not only did no one want to challenge the status quo, nobody had even tried. But Dida wasn't about to shrink in the face of adversity. That's why after 2 years, he would leave Cruzeiro and join Victoria's youth team, joining a club and environment that was willing to take the risk, one that supported him and nurtured his abilities, rather than questioning them or being cautious. More and more, his imposing presence and lightning-fast reflexes would set him apart. And in 1993, at 20 years old, he would finally make his professional debut. In his debut season, he would play 24 matches and was so dominant that he was named the best goalkeeper in the Brazilian league, the youngest player to ever receive the award. His performances were so incredible that a year later, he was brought back to Cruzeiro, ironically the same club that wasn't all that willing to support him during his youth days. But in just his first year with Cruzeiro, he would help his club lift the Copa de Ouro. By now, Dida was already a rising star in Brazil, a complete anomaly, but the image of black Brazilian goalkeepers was still overwhelmingly negative. However, in 1995 came a moment that would change everything. Brazil would decide to call him up for the Copa America, the first black Brazilian goalkeeper to be called up for the national team since Barbosa. However, Dida was still young and untested in the international level. Many weren't even expecting him to play, but fate had different plans. With goalkeeper Claudio Taffarel suspended, Brazil had to make a change, and it was a decision that carried more weight than most would realize. Some would argue that Dida's inclusion in the team was merely political, and he was never intended to actually play. But even as the decision was inevitable, Brazil's management was incredibly hesitant. For the fans, many of who had never even witnessed Barbosa's mistake, the fear of history repeating itself once more had kept their minds closed. And yet the decision was finally made. Dida would walk onto the pitch in yellow and green, breaking a barrier that stood for nearly half a century. Dida wasn't just playing for himself, he was playing for every black goalkeeper in South America and Europe who've always been told that they were never good enough. He was playing for every boy who had abandoned their dream because of a prejudice that never should have existed. His performances were solid and fearless, and with that single match, Dida proved that the ghosts of the past did not have to dictate the future. He had rewritten the script, and that was really only the beginning of what would be a legendary career. Although Dida would also be selected for Brazil in the 1996 Gold Cup and the 1998 World Cup, he was still rather young and chosen to be the backup, and there was still a lot of work to do to eventually clean up the prejudice of black goalkeepers. He was not yet the towering, unshakable figure who would one day command the goal of one of club football's most dominant dynasties, but still his inclusion and presence alone was enough to start to shake perceptions. At first, many were wondering, why is there a black goalkeeper on the squad? But over time, slowly and surely, as his talent would become more well-known and more undeniable, the narrative would slowly change to why isn't he starting? At Cruzeiro, Dida was the foundation upon which the team's success was built. Over 5 seasons, he would make 188 appearances, playing an absolutely instrumental role in securing 4 state championships, a Copa do Brasil, and most prestigiously, the Copa Libertadores. His performances would earn him back-to-back Best Goalkeeper awards in Brazil's domestic league, slowly confirming what many had began to suspect, that Dida was a player that would become too big for Brazil's domestic league. But to truly break barriers, Dida had to prove himself at the highest level, and that meant playing at the biggest stages of Europe's top 5 leagues. And the opportunity came when AC Milan would express their interest. Cruzeiro, however, were unwilling to part with their star, and they would refuse to greenlight the move. Not only did Cruzeiro's youth team barely support him, but now they were hampering him from breaking even more boundaries. Dida would eventually take legal action to free himself from his contract, and this legal battle would stretch over 5 exhausting months, a period in which he had to train with Swiss side Lugano to maintain his fitness. And finally, in May of 1999, Dida had beat his case. Finally, a Milan player at last. However, Dida's move to Milan wasn't exactly what he had envisioned. Instead of stepping into the limelight, he found himself in the reserves behind club legends. And this would ironically lead to Dida returning to Brazil on loan, this time playing for one of his former club's biggest rivals, Corinthians. The loan back to Brazil was fuel for the haters, but on the contrary, during this single loan, Dida's reputation would soar higher than it ever did. He returned in even better form, exhibiting the full range of his shot-stopping abilities. But of all of them, his most notable was during penalty situations. Dida's lightning-fast reflexes and reputation for outguessing opponents earned him the nickname the King of Penalties. Dida's teammates would even recall that the squad would enter shootouts with a near mystical belief that Dida had the ability to win them the match single-handedly. And the belief was validated when Dida's heroics would help Corinthians secure the FIFA Club World Cup and Brazil Serie A title that very same year. This time, Dida was ready to return to Milan and take the responsibility of defending their goal. However, before he could do that, controversy would strike. At the time, Italian clubs were restricted in the number of non-European players they could register, and Dida, along with several other South American players, became the center of a passport fraud scandal. That's right, before Ronaldinho would get memed for doing it, Dida and other Brazilian legends were way ahead of their time. Milan were devastated. They were desperate to have someone in front of goal, and Dida had finally proven himself ready to take on that role. Instead, he was handed a one-year ban from Italian and international football, along with a suspended prison sentence. So thus, Dida had to return back to Corinthians, but at least there, he would win 2 more titles, becoming such a Brazilian league legend that even the biggest doubters of black goalkeepers had no choice but to acknowledge him. And finally, in 2002, the appointment of Don Carlo Ancelotti at Milan, Dida would finally be asked to come back as the #1 option. And he would no doubt seize the opportunity with both hands, anchoring a defensive unit featuring Paolo Maldini and Alessandro Nesta, boasting one of, if not the safest goal in Europe. And that season was culminated in a legendary Champions League final against Juventus, where no other than Dida, the king of penalties, would use his penalty-saving prowess to overcome the opposition. With Dida at goal and his ability, reputation, and hauntingly towering presence, Milan would emerge victorious. Even years later, Juventus manager Marcelo Lippi admitted that several of his players outright refused to take penalties out of fear of facing Dida. By the mid-2000s, Dida was among the most formidable goalkeepers in the planet. And in the 2004-2005 Champions League, Dida would set a record with 7 consecutive clean sheets, guiding Milan to yet another final. But as some of you might recall, that final would be the infamous miracle at Istanbul. Though Dida would make crucial saves in the ensuing penalty shootout, AC Milan's penalty takers just weren't as reliable as Liverpool. Although it was a massive shock and a stain in Milan's history, by then Dida was already breaking barriers at the highest level. But just 2 years later, he and Milan would have their revenge, as they would once more face Liverpool in the 2007 Champions League final. And this time, Dida was just as brilliant, as Liverpool would break down Milan's defense and an equalizing goal looked inevitable. Dida would pull off a miraculous save, helping Milan win 2-1 and lifting his 2nd Champions League trophy. By now, Dida had shown the world enough. Not only were they convinced, but they were witnessing in the moment that a black goalkeeper was not only incredibly talented, but that he could also perform at the highest level under the brightest lights. The latter years of Dida's career were marked by struggles with injuries and a gradual decline in form. By 2010, his decade-long tenure at Milan would come to an end. After nearly a dozen trophies in Europe, winning the IFFHS World's Best Goalkeeper Silver and Bronze Ball, also having been included into the FIFA World 11, winning the Goalkeeper of the Year award, and being named the best Brazilian goalkeeper of the 21st century, Dida undoubtedly shattered the prejudice and stereotypes of black goalkeepers, paving the way for guys like Eduardo Mendy and even Andre Onana to be in the position they are today. The fact that he was the first black goalkeeper in Brazil for nearly half a century, and one of the only black goalkeepers in Europe's top 5 leagues during an era of many other all-time great goalkeepers like Gianluigi Buffon, Oliver Kahn, Edwin van der Sar, Petr Cech, and many more, in his prime was right up there next to them. Dida would change footballing history, and for that alone, even without his all-time great ability and skill, Dida will forever be a legend.